Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Calderon Muñiz.
Welcome. We're really excited. I don't know about you, Phil, but I'm absurdly excited about today's topic. I cannot believe we haven't talked about this topic in an episode before from a testable perspective.
I know.
This has come up so many times. And what I don't want you guys to do is do this while you're listening to the episode. Don't fall asleep on us. We always encourage you guys to get enough sleep, and we just haven't had the opportunity to talk about how the MCAT will test you on sleep. And so this is incredibly important, and maybe you'll get some tips on how to get better sleep and when you understand how you sleep.
Yeah, I really thought you were going to start off with like a big yawn and just be like,
Nah.
No, but that's because this is not sleepy at all. This is exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I think sleep is something that maybe I'm just old, but I like think about sleep more often. And I'm like, I just want more sleep. I just want to sleep better. I think it is because I'm getting old. And like, I wake up in the morning, like an hour before the alarm goes off. And I'm like, come on, my old man body. Like, why don't you like sleep until your alarm goes off? But today, we're going to talk about sleep, everything that is MCAT testable about sleep. There's a whole lot of stuff here, so I think there's a good chance we might split this up over 2 episodes. But we should start off talking about the brain and brain activity and how we measure that so that we can talk about like the different stages of sleep and what happens in sleep. And so this is something that's a little confusing. I feel like every once in a while I come across something and I just want to shake the scientist who named it. I'm like, why did you do it that way? Like, that's going to make things more complicated. But so what happened is they developed this device called an EEG, or electroencephalogram. It's basically a funky hat covered in electrodes that can figure out how active your brain is generally. It's not going to give you like really hyper-specific localizations of where your brain is being active, but it will measure overall what's going on with brain activity. I want to clarify that because the MCAT will expect you to know like an fMRI or a PET scan can show you exactly where your brain is active. But an EEG tells you just how active generally is your brain. And what they did is they had somebody sit in a chair, put on this hat, and they're like, all right, don't move. We're going to measure your brain. And then what they measured out of that, they called alpha waves. And then they're like, okay, this is a brain. This is the activity of a brain. And they got all excited because they had some data. And then they're like, okay, let's look at it if you're doing like a bunch of math problems and like, you know, like in a conversation or things like that, when somebody is engaged mentally in something. And so they measured that and they said, hey, these are beta waves. And like the waves were a lot higher frequency and there's just a lot more activity going on. The reason I'm annoyed by this is now beta wave is the most active wave and alpha is like somewhere in the middle. And as you sleep, you can go deeper and even lower activity. And I just get really annoyed because alpha should be like the most active or the least active or one of those. But for some reason, it's in the middle. But that's just because they discovered that one first. As you go further into sleep, as your brain gets less and less active, you might move into theta and then delta waves. You probably don't need to be able to recognize these visually. Like you're not going to have to look at an EEG and say, is this person in theta waves or delta waves? But you do need to know that beta is the most active, then alpha, then theta, and then delta.
Yeah, we'll leave the interpretation of the EEGs to the neurologists.
Yeah.
If you're interested in neurology, you will be looking at EEGs just to kind of bring in the medical school and future career perspective. There are a lot of different reasons that people can get EEGs. They can get them outpatient, they can get them inpatient in the hospital, depending on what you're looking for. And so even though, they're more limited in information, there are patterns that you can find in something like a seizure versus if someone has, altered mental status due to toxins building up in their body. And so you can still get a lot of rich information from this. You mentioned the alpha waves, and I really like alpha waves in part because of when you'll see them. And so, like you mentioned, it can be kind of baseline if the person's just sitting there, not doing a whole lot. And so, when you're active and you're going about your life, you have a lot of beta waves. But when you sit down, you start meditation, you can actually slow your brain waves into the alpha wave pattern. And so I had just, I think, told you this story, but back in undergrad, I had a friend who was doing some neuroscience research, and they were having us doing problems, and the goal was to get through them as quickly and efficiently as possible, but also trying to stay calm. And somehow I managed to get through it with alpha waves. And I don't know what that says about me, but if only that worked for things like exams. But it just talks to the power of, breathing and meditation and slowing your body down. It actually calms the mind. It calms your brain. And so there's so much there that we don't think about, no pun intended.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of power in that. And so, like you mentioned, those alpha waves, less active than the beta waves, but have their own place in our day-to-day life. And so in chatting about that, it's worth noting how our body treats sleep and how we actually go through different stages of sleep. Because like you mentioned, we have all of these different waveforms. So what happens when we're falling asleep and when we're sleeping?
Yeah. So we have different stages of sleep. Turns out all sleep is not equal. There's different things going on in your brain at different times. I'm kind of curious about that study you were doing now, Azaii, though, just for a minute. Were you doing like math problems that seem pretty like comfortable for you? I wonder if like math anxiety would throw somebody into like beta waves for somebody who's like very comfortable with math might be like, okay, going into alpha waves.
I don't remember if it was math or one of those where they have you do like identification. So I don't know if you've ever seen those where you have to pair like a word with an image or something like that.
Okay.
You try to go as fast as you can.
Yeah. Interesting.
It might have been either that or some kind of calculation or going back and forth. I don't exactly remember because I've done some of these more than once.
Right.
Just not always with EEGs. But
yeah. But yeah, I think that might be something. I feel like a lot of pre-med students who are like thinking about like taking tests and things like that. I'm betting that in the MCAT, pretty much no one's moving into alpha waves.
No.
It is too complicated. The passages, the questions.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are, then you're a Zen master.
Yeah.
But,
if only it worked.
Yes, if only. So talking about the stages of sleep, this is something that there is a little bit of disagreement in some circles. But there are some things that we all agree with. We all know that there's a stage of sleep called REM, or rapid eye movement, REM. And so the idea here is when you go into this stage of sleep, your eyes are moving all over the place. Like your eyes are hopefully closed. Otherwise, it's going to be kind of weird. But like your eyes are going to be like kind of twitching back and forth. And so you can tell visually when somebody is in REM sleep. If you just look at their eyes, because it turns out the eye isn't a perfect circle or perfect sphere. And so like where your cornea is a little bit of a bump. And so when that moves underneath an eyelid, you can kind of see it and detect it. But when you go into REM sleep, you get very active brain waves. This is actually the only stage while in sleep that you're likely to see beta waves. So beta waves, just to remind you, that's like really active stuff. So when your brain is really active, so it turns out in REM sleep, your brain is really active. Now, this probably correlates to the fact that when in REM sleep, this is when dreaming is occurring. And so most of your dreams occur during REM sleep, which makes sense because you have this beta wave thing going on. Now, there's another kind of thing that's pretty interesting here from the perspective of REM sleep, and that is muscle paralysis. So while you're in this REM stage, under normal conditions, your muscles should be paralyzed. And I know that seems weird, and everyone's like, wait, what? Why? Why do you become paralyzed in REM? But just think about it. Like if you are dreaming that you are fighting a bear, all right, it is probably not a good idea for you to be able to thrash and punch and kick, right? Because otherwise, if someone's in bed next to you, you're going to punch them in the face. Or if no one's in bed next to you, you might just jump out of the bed and run into the wall. And it's good to be asleep when you're doing that. I don't know if you've seen that video, as I have a dog that was dreaming and it's like running and then it jumps up and runs into the wall.
No, I have not seen that video.
I feel like it's a semi-famous YouTube video. But yeah, and so it's good that we don't do that, right? Like I'm glad that I don't jump up out of bed and run into the wall whenever I'm dreaming that I'm running. And so this sleep paralysis, or this paralysis while sleeping, I want to be careful. Sleep paralysis is actually a parasomnia disorder that we will talk about at some point. But this paralysis while sleeping happens in the REM stage. And so it's kind of interesting because your eyes are super active, but your muscles outside of the eye muscles are very inactive. And you can actually measure that in a couple of different ways. But yeah, so that's all happening in REM sleep.
Now, REM sleep, you kind of have to build your way up to REM sleep, or I guess build down, then up. And so when you're falling asleep, the first stage that we call of non-REM sleep is stage 1, aptly named. They were kind to us with that. And in non-REM sleep, you're going to have slower brain waves. Like you talked about, those theta and those delta waves. And so in stage 1, you're going to have theta waves. So those are going to be those lower amplitude waves as well. And actually, I suggest taking a look at them just because it kind of, like you said, you don't have to identify them on test day, in some EEG, but it can just be helpful to know what they look like. And so with the theta waves, your body's slowing down. You might still have some muscle twitches while you're in stage 1 of sleep. And I apologize if I said REM. I keep, but hopefully I said stage 1.
Yeah.
And you can also have some really interesting things that happen during this stage while you're falling asleep and whatnot. But this is just kind of the basic. We're starting off. We're going to deepen. It's a fairly light stage of sleep. It's out of the 3-ish stages of non-REM sleep. Yeah, Phil, you're laughing. You know it's coming up.
Mm-hmm.
Out of those stages, you're going to have this lighter sleep. But as you move forward, or as you move down and into deeper stages of sleep, then you're going to have stage 2 sleep. And this is also going to be non-REM sleep. It's also going to be, you're also going to have theta waves. So again, those slower waves. But unlike stage 1, it's a deeper stage of sleep, and you're actually going to have these small bursts of activity. And if you were looking at an EEG, you would see things like sleep spindles. And so it's when instead of having those same theta waves, it goes up, 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 and then back to theta waves. And you'll also see things called K complexes. And so during this stage of sleep, you don't really want to be waking up, right? Your body needs these deeper stages of sleep. And so these K complexes actually serve to kind of block out the external stimuli that could wake you up. And so our body, our brains have a way of shutting out the world, which needs to happen, right? You're going to have these external stimuli, and they may not be very intense. They might be, softer. Maybe you live in an urban area and you have this kind of background noise, or maybe you live in a really quiet area. And so it might just be the hum of a fan, but you want to make sure that you can, or your body and your brain wants to make sure that you can stay asleep. And so that's one of the ways that it will ensure that. Kind of analogous to how in REM sleep, your body paralyzes you so you don't go out and you don't act out a dream.
Yeah. And so we move kind of like through these stages. I like that you mentioned like non-REM sleep. Sometimes you'll hear scientists, and you may see this on the MCAT, refer to sleep as REM sleep and NREM or NREM sleep, aka non-REM sleep. So we have REM and then we have non-REM. And the non-REM, we have like the stage 1 and 2, like you're talking about with the theta waves. But as you go farther, you start to slip deeper into sleep, and your brain becomes even less active and moves kind of into delta waves. Now, this is where things get a little bit messy. And this is why you said there's like 3-ish stages. It kind of depends on who you talk to.
Yep.
There are some scientists, and I believe this came first, that said there was stage 1, 2, 3, and 4 of non-REM sleep. But later on, like the more we studied this, the more like that line between stage 3 and stage 4 became kind of blurred. And so some people say that there's stage 1, 2, and 3, and that's it. Some people say it's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Some people are like, okay, we understand that. Like if I say stage 3 sleep, people are going to get confused. Like, is that 3 out of 4 or 3 out of 3 of them? And so they're like, you know what? Let's not even call it stage 3 and stage 4. Let's call it slow wave sleep. And so it's got a different name. And the reason I'm going into this is you need to be prepared to see any of those on test day. So they may say slow wave sleep. That means stage 3 and 4. They may say in a passage that there are stages 1, 2, and 3 of non-REM sleep. They may say in a passage there's 1, 2, 3, and 4 of non-REM sleep. You need to be like able to deal with all of those scenarios if they throw them at you. So it's one of those scenarios where it's like, it's another example of where I want to shake the scientist. I'm like, come on. I'm like, get your act together, guys. Beta it doesn't make sense to be the most active. Like, was there 3 or 4 non-REM stages? Let's all agree on this. But regardless, we have to deal with it. And be able to deal with that on test day. Now, just one more kind of like thing about this delta waves, like the stage 3 and stage 4. Your brain is very inactive. Like you're zonked in this scenario where, and this is probably something that you've experienced with, like being woken up at different times, where sometimes when I wake up, I just kind of like pop up out of bed and I'm like, I understand. And like, my brain's clear and I kind of feel great. Sometimes like somebody wakes me up and I am like, it takes me a second to realize, where am I? Who am I? What is going on? Like, I can't, like, getting my brain kind of jump started and working again is sometimes like really difficult. And so that usually means that you're in like stage 3 or stage 4 sleep. So those times where you're just out of it, usually when somebody wakes you up, it's kind of hard to naturally wake up in stage 3 and 4 because your brain's so inactive. But if you have an alarm that goes off or somebody wakes you up and you have a really hard time, like your brain is just kind of like not on, there's a good chance you were in that deeper stage 3, stage 4 sleep. I remember specifically, so I have a bunch of younger siblings, and when I would wake them up in the morning, like if I didn't like make sure that they were actually awake, like I know that they would like slip back and just like fall back asleep. And so I was the really annoying brother that was like shaking them. And I'm like, all right, it's time to wake up, Zach. And he's like, I'm awake. I'm like, all right, what's 15 plus 7? And he's like, just leave me alone. I'm like, no, I'm like, you answer this math question and then I will leave you alone. And because I knew that like once he'd answer that math question, his brain was active enough that he wasn't going to be able to like slip back into sleep. I wasn't thinking about it in those terms of like brain activity and stages of sleep, but I just knew that like if I made him answer some math questions, he'd be up and get up and start moving.
I've definitely, I remember as a child, my older brother doing things like that. There are so many nuggets that I want to say. The first is thinking about your future patients when you are in the hospital. You will have to often do what's called pre-round on them, meaning you go see them before the team goes see them. Often, you might be doing this at 6 in the morning, 5:30 in the morning, 6:30. Your patients are sleeping. You might go in and they might not give you the same answers as they give later because they're half asleep. So something that I like to do is I'll wake the patient up and I'll say, okay, let me give you a second. Do you need a second to kind of finish waking up? Yeah, okay. And just give them those 10 seconds. You're more likely to get useful information when they are slightly more awake. The other thing is there's a mnemonic that you can use to remember the different stages of sleep. So it's a bat drinks blood. So A for alpha, this is when you're kind of in that very slow, you're kind of starting to fall asleep, but not asleep yet, and thinking that meditation correlate, you're not fully active. And the B stands for beta. And so this is simply REM, but keeping in mind that you work your way up to REM, but it's helpful to know that REM, which is something that will increase as you are sleeping for a longer period of time, is there. I actually shouldn't have said alpha. So be awake and also REM. Alpha, you're falling asleep. T is for theta, stages 1 and stages 2. For stage 3, that's the delta. So you've already finished the bat, drinks. And then eventually, after working your way back up, you'll hit beta for REM again. So this bat, beta, you're awake. Alpha, you're falling asleep. Theta, you are asleep, stages 1 and 2. Drinks, delta, stage 3, 4, question mark, slow stage sleep. And then drinks blood, you're eventually making it back to REM sleep. So that could be a helpful way to think about this. Something else I want to say, I said I had a lot of nuggets. A lot of people try and use their phones or their Fitbits or smartwatches to track how often they're in different stages of sleep. Be careful with those. They are not the most accurate. The way that they often work is measuring your movement. But you can think of a lot of scenarios where you are moving, right? And it may not be the most accurate thing. Or you can also have situations where you wake up in the middle of the night and maybe it doesn't register that you're actually up because you didn't get out of bed. But now you're moving and so it thinks you're in a different stage of sleep. Or you are laying in bed and you are being a potato and you are scrolling through any sort of social media and it thinks you are sleeping. Mm-hmm. So take whatever results you get from that with a grain of salt. These technologies are imperfect and something to keep in mind. Last nugget. Oh, wait, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I agree. Like if you really want to measure those, you kind of have to wear EEG, like you have to do an electroencephalogram, which is how they do like sleep studies where they're measuring kind of what's happening. Yeah. But like smartwatches can be kind of useful for trying to measure those things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The last nugget, you mentioned that students need to be ready to see whichever version of sleep, those latter stages of sleep on test day. I just want to remind all of us, the reason that that's the case is that the AEMC takes excerpts from actual pieces of literature, from scientific papers. For cars, they take excerpts from, novels, other literary pieces. They are not writing this from scratch. So because there is disagreement in the scientific world about what we're going to call these, you can see any version of this. And so I think a lot of times as students, we'll get into this mindset of, oh, this is exactly how I learned it, so this is exactly how I'm going to see it. But you've got to have a little bit of mental flexibility on test day. And that's why I know, Phil, you and I have talked about so often, both on the podcast and offline, about the importance of being able to make connections and to see patterns and to recognize when a topic comes up that's testable, because it may not come up in exactly the form that we learn it. I just wanted to say that.
No, and that's a big part of it. And I feel like that is often hard. I mean, because that's not what we want as people who are studying, just kind of like taking a step back as like from a student's perspective, like I want to learn the way that things are. Tell me what it is, test me on it, and then I'll do well. But when you tell me like, man, we're not really sure, I might test you in a couple of different ways, nobody knows exactly, like that gets really frustrating because it's like, wait a minute, like you're going to test me on stuff and we don't even know if it's right. And you might do something else. And that could be really confusing. But as you get further in your medical career, as you get further in your academic career, you start to reach the edges of what we know. And what happens is the lines get blurrier, things become less clear, and you're more dealing with like, okay, there's a couple of hypotheses on how this works, and like try to figure out and applying those can be a little bit trickier. That's something that I know frustrates a lot of students as they go into the MCAT, where it's like, okay, wait, there's like 3 different versions of this that I need to learn. For example, how do we deal with emotions like Schachter, Singer, James, Lane, Cannon, Bard? Like, why do we have to learn all 3 of these? Isn't it just one of them? We're not really sure. And like, it seems to be a mixture. Sometimes it looks like one, sometimes another. And so that makes things difficult. And I understand the frustration from students, but it's something that just as a part of it's something to be happy about in a weird way. Is like, once you get to that area, you know that you're reaching the boundaries of the field where we're kind of like learning. And so we're starting to learn some stuff now about sleep that we're like starting to approach some boundaries. Sleep is not perfectly understood. We understand like how the heart works way better than we understand how the brain works. And That's one of the things some of you guys might be excited to go into neurology because of this. I know I was, where I'm like, oh, there's so many mysteries left to solve and things left to learn. I do want to talk a little bit more about these sleep cycles. Like as you like go from this, you go from like awake and 1, 2, 3, 4 question mark.
Yep.
And then you go back up to REM, and then you go back down to deep sleep and back up to REM and back down to deep sleep, and kind of going through this. Generally, as the night goes on, you are spending less and less time in that deep sleep. And so you go down there less and less. So this is why, like, if you are like really tired and you take a nap, it takes about an hour-ish, depending on the scenario, depending on the person, to get into that like deep sleep. Note that in that stage, it's hard to wake up and you're groggy and kind of out of it. And so that's why, at least speaking anecdotally for me, like a 30-minute nap, I can like take a 30-minute nap and I wake up and I feel great. I could take a 2-hour nap, which I don't get the chance to do like ever, but I could. And I would wake up and I would feel great. If I do 1 hour or 45 minutes or like an hour and 15 minutes, like I feel terrible. And I am just out of it and groggy and like not in the zone. And it's because what happened is I went down to that deep sleep and then my alarm went off and I'm trying to get up and get going in that and I'm kind of out of it. So that's for you nappers out there. You can kind of understand why different lengths of naps feel terrible. There's a lot of people who say like, I can't nap. I always feel terrible. And a part of me is like, did you set it for an hour? Because then yeah, you would feel terrible. And going through that. But so that's kind of an interesting thing. But also as you go through this sleep cycle, the later and later you stop going into that deep sleep. So if you've been sleeping for like 8 hours or 7 hours or 9 hours, there's not really much of a chance. Like you should not be in that super deep sleep, or the average person is not in that super deep sleep anywhere after like 5 hours. Like they're never going to be in that. And so there's not really a danger of like waking up and being super, super out of it. I want to be clear, under normal conditions, there's some deviance within people. But that's also why like kids, their sleep cycle is different than adults. They need more sleep. And so they tend to go into those deeper sleep for longer, which is why like most of my time, like now remembering waking up and being super out of it and groggy, I feel like most of that happened when I was younger. And that doesn't really happen as much now. Once again, I have my old man brain going that makes me wake up an hour before the alarm goes off. But like this, your sleep needs change. And so your sleep cycle changes over time. And that's kind of an important thing to kind of understand as well. And that might also help you understand, like if you're doing an EEG on a child, like the patterns you see there should be different than the EEG in an adult. Speaking of like changing over time and changing sleep patterns, note that sleep cycles, we generally say like we work on a 24-hour day. I want to be clear, a lot of that comes from external stimulus, right? From sunlight. That's also why like being on your phone can mess with your sleep cycle. Like if you're on your phone at like midnight, your sleep cycle is going to start to get messed up. There are some things you can do to help that. One, just don't be on your phone. But two, if you have like a night mode on your phone, it uses more red light than blue light. And blue light tends to like mess with our sleep cycle more overall. And so there are some things you can do with that. But the sleep cycle is not 24 hours naturally. Now I want to say, like, I want to put that in quotes because in nature, yeah, it's 24 hours. But if you take a person and put them in a room with no lights and no like sun rising and setting, let's say there are lights, but you can kind of control them. People don't naturally go to a 24-hour sleep cycle. One of my favorite experiments, there was a French scientist who studied sleep, somnologist, which is a good name, named Michel Siffre. And he, a couple of times over the course of his life, would do these experiments where he would go into a cave and he would just like there's no sun, there's no, like he would not put clocks in there. He'd have no way to tell the time. He'd have this little like phone that he could pick up and be like, tired, I'm going to bed. And he'd like hang up the phone and then he'd go to bed. And then when he'd wake up in the morning, he'd grab the phone and be like, all right, I woke up. And then he would just like hang up the phone. And so what happened is his sleep cycle, his day, the length of his day kept getting longer, like 24, 25 hours, and then kind of like moving past that. And so the research, once again, is not super concrete because like there's not a lot of people who are willing to go and live in a cave without a clock or without the internet, because you can figure out the time if you want on the internet for like 6 months at a time. That's not a lot of people doing that. But his research showed that like it could stretch up into like 40 hours and more, where someone would spend like 30, 35 hours awake and then like 15 hours sleep, somewhere in that range. And so they would 30, 35, like 12 to 50, somewhere in this range. And so just note that like there's a lot of external cues coming in to help us regulate our sleep. And so if you are working in a hospital, like I know when I was in medical school, like I wouldn't go outside during daylight hours because I'm like studying all day, like in the basement of this building in the anatomy lab. And so my sleep cycle would start to get messed up. And then especially you add in like being on a phone or a laptop or in front of screens at night, that would kind of alter it as well. But I also want to mention jet lag, because as you go to another country and like the sun is rising and falling at different times, totally messes with your sleep cycle. And note that like a lot of Michel Cifre's research showed that we want like our sleep cycle naturally is longer, not shorter than 24 hours. And we just match it to whatever's going on with the sun in that area. And so this is very anecdotal. And so this is not scientific. But I like somewhat recently, not super recent, but I went to Asia once, and like the flight to Asia, I really didn't experience much jet lag while like in that trip there. And I was kind of fine. Like, I was kind of like a little bit sleepy and like adjusting to that. Like it took like a day, but then flying back was way worse. And it was like 3 days. Like I was just out of it for 3 days, hardcore. And that might be because of the way that the sleep cycle was shifting, and that shifting longer is maybe a little bit easier for my body to deal with than shifting it shorter. Generally speaking, it's a little bit easier to stay awake than it is to force yourself to sleep when you're not sleepy. And so some of these like shifts and things are very interesting. I will also mention like your temperature regulates, and there's like biological things that happen during your sleep cycle during different stages. You don't really need to go super deep into that for this level of the MCAT.
Yeah, maybe not helpful for the MCAT, but I do want to provide some practical tips for those of you that are studying, and perhaps sleep is something that is lower on your list of priorities, but that can be super important. So like you mentioned, if your phone or whatever your devices are, and again, this is practical, this is not MCAT testable, putting the blue light filter on, blue light filtering glasses are becoming very popular and are fairly inexpensive depending on where you get them. And so those can also be helpful to minimize eye strain throughout the day as well. Keeping wherever you're going to be sleeping slightly cooler can also help with falling asleep. Things like blackout curtains, if you can get your hands on them, but even if you can't get your hands on them, what can be really helpful, because I don't know about you guys, but in my apartment, I have those blinds that have slits. And so a lot of light will come through even when you close the blinds. But even having any kind of extra sheet that you have over it can also provide some help with minimizing the amount of sunlight that comes in, especially for folks that work night shifts. I know some of our listeners are probably working night shifts. And so all of these external stimuli can make it really tough for that to kind of balance out. Avoiding your phone, even with the blue light filter and the night filter, you're still getting some stimuli. And so things like, it sounds really annoying and old school, but reading a book, jotting things down on a journal, those kinds of things can be really helpful. And you'll also hear about things like white noise, brown noise, pink noise. Those can be helpful, especially if you live in an area with a lot of background noise. That steady noise can also help. And then we've talked about this in the past, but for waking up, If anyone heard our Fighting Depression with Light podcast episode, those light boxes can provide stimulus to also wake up. And so there are lots of different ways, some of which, yes, involve buying things, others that don't involve buying things, that can be really helpful when you're thinking about creating a steady sleep schedule.
Yeah. And this is something that is like, I love it when topics are both like, oh, this is MCAT testable, but it's also useful just in everyday life. Like it is, the better you understand sleep, like it's a big part of your life, right? Like you will spend a third of your life roughly sleeping. And so understanding kind of how it works and how to maximize what you are getting out of your sleep, I think can be super useful. But we're gonna talk a little bit more about sleep in another episode here in the future as we talk about like what happens when sleep goes wrong, when we have like disorders, dysomnias, and parasomnias. All these things are definitely MCAT testable. But hopefully you have a good understanding of like different stages of sleep, what's going on in those stages, like your sleep cycle, how that can be affected, what's going on with EEGs and measuring brain activity, because all those are highly testable MCAT content.